Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Engaging Youth in Agriculture webinar. We are very excited for everyone to be joining us today as we are going to be launching the Feed the Future Project Design Guide for Youth Inclusive Agriculture and Food Systems, Volume 1 and Volume 2. My name is Hillary Proctor, and I'm the Director of Technical Services at Making Sense. I am joined here this morning by several of my colleagues. We have Meredith McCormick from the Bureau of Food Security at USAID. I'm also joined by Rachel Bloom, who is one of the contributing authors of the guide, along with David Feige, another contributing author. I'm also joined here today by two of our youth experts. We have Ignatius Ahumuza, who is the co-founder and executive director of Art Planet Academy, and Patricia Gachinga, who is the head of production at Media Company as well. So to launch our guide, we're going to start out by talking a bit about why youth in agriculture and have a chance to explore this topic. Then we will turn on over and hear more about our youth and voices and the intersection there before we dive into really exploring the guide, what's involved with it, along with a few sneak previews of what's inside, and then finishing up with a what's next and where are the resources. We will take questions and answers at the end, but please feel free to ask your questions along the way. You can do so in the side chat bar, and we will be pulling them in and addressing them as we go. So with that, I would like to turn things over to Meredith to get us started.
Great, thanks. Well, firstly, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. As Hillary mentioned, my name is Meredith McCormick, and I work in the Bureau for Food Security at USAID. As many of you are aware, in 2016, Congress passed the Global Food Security Act with bipartisan support, and the new legislation called for the development of a whole-of-government global food security strategy to guide Feed the Future through its second phase of implementation. And the new strategy really reflects a great deal of learning and analysis that we gained from the first 5 years of Feed the Future. And so we've developed this new strategy framework, which you can see. And the strategy was developed in coordination with 11 Feed the Future partner agencies and departments and has the overarching goal to sustainably reduce global hunger, malnutrition, and poverty. And to achieve this overarching goal, we realized that we need to strengthen the capacities of all participants throughout the food and agriculture system, paying special attention to women, the extreme poor, small-scale producers, marginalized communities, and youth. And so increased youth employment and livelihoods is now a cross-cutting intermediate result in our new framework. As you can see, it's number 4. And so why is Feed the Future focusing on youth? Well, as you all know, young people are entering the labor market in very large numbers, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where an average 11 million young people reach working age each year. Agriculture is and will continue to be a significant source of employment and income in countries where Feed the Future works. And so USAID and our Feed the Future partners recognized that we needed to think more strategically about how we harness the creativity and energy of youth and help them find meaningful employment within the agro-food systems. Because that's the only way we're going to be able to reach our goals of reducing poverty, hunger, and malnutrition. So a variety of stakeholders from USAID Washington and our missions have been working with Making Sense over the last year to develop this guide. And we really hope that this will help USAID staff and implementing partners think about and address the distinct aspirations, assets, opportunities, and barriers of young people throughout the program cycle. And so another way we are doing this is by tracking our results. Since the beginning of Feed the Future, we have prioritized monitoring and evaluation, and we recently rolled out the new Feed the Future Indicator Handbook for the second phase of Feed the Future. And there we've included a new youth indicator and options for disaggregating several indicators by age. So with this, we will track our results, engaging youth, and learn from our programs moving forward. So we're really excited about that. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Hillary.
Excellent. Thank you, Meredith. So to help us continue our conversation and framing the release of the guide, I would like us to hear from two experts on this. We have two young people who have joined us who have spent their careers supporting other people in agriculture. So Ignatius and Patricia, I'd like you guys to introduce yourselves to the audience and let's hear a little bit about you. Ignatius, maybe you can go first.
I'm Ignatius from Uganda. I'm a founder at the Art Planet Academy. Basically, the Art Planet Academy is a youth-led agriculture social enterprise that looks at how we can redirect the way youth are empowered towards a climate-smart agriculture revolution, because we want to see a generation where youth are engaging and practicing agriculture both as profitable and decent employment within the rural parts of Uganda.
Good, thank you.
I'm Patricia, and I work for the Media Company. Media Company basically looks to improve livelihoods and shape sustainable development across East Africa. We use TV, radio, and SMS to pass messages to people and hope to impact on their knowledge, attitude, and practice. Our information is very timely and easy to understand, and our main focus is on agriculture, food security, and agri-entrepreneurship.
Perfect. Well, it's wonderful to hear both of your amazing backgrounds that you have in the work that you've been doing. So let me first start by asking you, why is agriculture relevant for young people?
In Uganda, where I come from, you realize 80% of our land is arable. That means if you did agriculture on it, you'd get positive results. Now, this coupled by the fact that we do not have enough employment in our country, yet our land is fertile, you're left with no option rather than engaging that land. Because we have a good climate, we have good soils, but we lack employment. Why then don't we convert those two opportunities into self-employment through agriculture? So I believe we just have to tap into those opportunities around our climate and the soils being arable, because our employment rates, especially in the so-called formal sector, is not so appealing.
Mm-hmm. Patricia, why do you find that agriculture is relevant for youth?
In Kenya, agriculture is very important for youth. The average farmer is about 60 years in Kenya, and there are many farms where they're less than half the farm has been cultivated due to the age of the farmer and the energy to invest in the farming. Many of the older farmers practice subsistence farming, and such the production of the country remains very low, causing most of the countries to be net importers of food. Yet we can produce this food. These farmers, the older generation, tend to be slower to innovate and change attitudes and practice or use ICT for communication or to improve their farms. So this is very important for the young people to start engaging in farming, because they have the energy, they have the skills and the innovation to be able to produce enough food to feed Africa.
Perfect. So building off of some of those comments about how young people can really gain through employment and opportunities in agriculture, how can young people help support agriculture and help build it up for that next generation and address some of the food security needs?
The very first principle I think these young men and women should consider is teaming up. So there is a lot of power and energy in teams when we come together, find our common goal, and work towards achieving it. I believe if, for us as the Art Planet Academy, the idea of teaming up, coming together to achieve our goal, a shared vision, has really worked. So I believe if this concept is achieved by youth in the different regions of Africa, there is no doubt we shall be able to attain the sustainable development goal around fighting hunger.
I think the way the youth can help build agricultural systems in Africa is, one, by engaging in the agricultural curriculum that has now been implemented in schools. If more and more youth can start tapping into that and stop looking at agriculture as a dirty thing to do, that would really help. The other thing that they would do is have a voice. A lot of young people actually want to farm. And they need to speak up about it and not just remain quiet and think, okay, I'm just going to do it alone. We need to speak up and say, this is a viable business and we can do this. The other way we can do it is using ICT and innovation. In Africa, 88% of the population of the youth are on their mobile phones. We can use mobile information and interact within ourselves in order to improve and build onto the agricultural systems in Africa.
Perfect. So the title of this guide that we're launching is called Youth Inclusive Agriculture and Food Systems. But what does that actually mean? What does youth inclusion into agriculture and this process look like to the two of you as young people who are involved in agriculture?
To me, youth inclusion in agriculture and food systems, I think this relates to how are you involving youth into framing policies, implementing policies, and evaluating policies that concern agriculture. Why would a 70-year-old frame a policy that is affecting the participation of a youth into agriculture? I believe youth understand problems of youth better, so they can frame policies that work for youth better. I think this starts from the policy level, involve the youth in planning a policy that will affect their engagement into agriculture.
Okay.
For me, youth inclusion will look something like this. First, youth should provide input at all stages, and this is from the decision making, the implementing, the monitoring. We need to have the youth voice onto that. The youth also need to be heard without judgment. People need to listen to them and see what it is that they want to do. Let's not assume that they want to go to a particular way. Let's listen to what they want to do. They want to do agribusiness. They don't want to plant crops that take a long time to come to fruition. They want to do high value crops that bring in money quickly. So we need to really listen to the voices of the youth without judgment. I think the other thing would be allocation of technical and financial resources to enhance this engagement. We need to invest in the technical information and also financial resources to this youth innovations in order to have it to succeed.
Those are some great pieces of advice. Getting young people engaged throughout the entire process, listening to what they really, truly want and responding to that, not forcing them into something, but making sure they're involved and their voices are heard. Excellent. Thank you. So I have one more question for the two of you. In our audience listening into this webinar, we have both USAID mission staff. We have staff here from Washington, D.C. We have implementers. We have people who are involved with foundations and other partners. What would you say is the reason of why youth in agriculture is important? Why do you think that we should really care and move this forward and advance it?
I think, especially to the supporters, if you want to see Uganda develop in the next 10-20 years, support someone who will be able to change the future. If you really supported a farmer who is 20 years, that means by the time they make 30, they'll have learned a lot. So they will have a lot to offer for that sector. There should be emphasis put on early development of the agricultural skills amongst these youth, because if someone started receiving agriculture training at an early age of maybe 15 years, by the time they make 30, they will have achieved a good package of skills that can enable them to execute this well, basing on the experience they've got and the knowledge that they have acquired. So I believe a lot of support should be injected into having these young men and women, understand how agriculture is supposed to be done in this new generation, because most of them have skills, yes, but these skills do not match this new generation. They are of the past generation, and perhaps they remain vulnerable, especially to climate change and a limited access to water for agriculture. Those are the major challenges that we are facing in the rural areas of Uganda. Away from that, there is a problem around market. Trust me, if there was market for whatever these people produce, then our communities would transform. If we could get linkages to better markets for our products, it would make more sense. If more emphasis was put on actually adding value onto what we produce, it makes sense. Why would a youth produce his tomatoes in Miria village in Masindi, yet they are not so sure of where they are going to sell it? Now, this leaves them reluctant because they know if I went into agriculture, I will have no market. I'll produce my tomatoes. After 1 week, they will go bad because I will not have any market. If we had a plant that is processing tomatoes, adding value, they will be so sure that if I produce my tomato, I have where I'm going to sell it because they're going to add value onto it. It won't go bad so soon. So I believe we should have better sources of water for agriculture, irrigation, better marketing strategies for these youth. Value addition should be prioritized in this section, and above all, skills training will be so important in the process.
I think this is very important for USAID because we are trying to secure a new generation of farmers by raising young people more into farming, and particularly women, therefore improving the food security through nutrition, knowledge, and food supply to the families and the number of young people in this continent of Africa. And I think through this, we'll be able to generate high levels of interaction and feedback from the youth, and this will help us create information on what is hindering the youth from entering into agriculture. And I think through this, it will help USAID to feed the policy dialogue to shape the future programs which will be more youth-centric in terms of policy. Because right now, we don't have that. And that is exactly what we need. That's why this is important for USAID.
Great. Thank you to both of you. Youth are both the future, but they are also our now as well. And it's wonderful to hear the two of you. So thank you for sharing your voices and your perspective with us. That helps us continue to frame our dialogue and why we feel that this is so important to be talking about, and also why Feed the Future has dedicated all of these resources to putting together this guide so that we can all take that step forward. And with that, I would like to turn it on over to my colleague, David Feige, who will start to walk us through the different volumes of the guide and explain on how Feed the Future is looking at addressing and taking some of these youth voices forward.
Thanks, Hillary. We only have about 10 minutes or so to cover both volumes of the guide, so we thought maybe the most useful thing would be to stress some of the key takeaways from volumes 1 and 2. You'll obviously have the opportunity to peruse the guide at your leisure later on. So the guide is essentially divided into 2 volumes. The first volume, which deals with project design, is oriented mostly toward USAID mission staff, USAID Washington staff, other donors who may be interested in making use of the guide. And we really have 5 key takeaways in volume 1. And the first is the importance of engaging young people throughout the program cycle. This was something that Patricia alluded to earlier, but really engaging young people in design, in solicitation development, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation is really critical. And that's partly because what we want to do is to reframe the role of young people in our programming so that it shifts from thinking about young people as beneficiaries of what we do to people who are actors and are actively involved in designing the kinds of programs that are going to affect their lives. The second key takeaway is the importance of including and drawing on the expertise of youth specialists. These may be specialists within the USAID missions. They may be specialists from USAID Washington. They may be dedicated consultants. But throughout sort of the design and solicitation development process, to really provide sort of a continuous youth lens so that that's something that we don't lose track of as we put our programs together. The third, and I would argue maybe the most critical point that sort of cuts across all of Volume 1, is the importance of identifying specific youth cohorts. I think there's a tendency on the part of a lot of us to think about young people as sort of one large homogenous group, when in reality the youth cohort is extremely heterogeneous. And because of that, we need to think about how we can most usefully segment to ensure that our programming is oriented toward the populations that we are trying to hit. Popular ways of segmenting may include by age, by gender, you can do it by income, and the guide goes into some depth in terms of a number of different ways that youth can be segmented. But the important thing is to ensure that we are doing that so that we're being very intentional about reaching the kinds of groups that we intend to reach, rather than sort of defaulting to the sort of the low-hanging fruit, which often tends to be older males and may leave out some of the populations we actually intend to hit. The fourth key takeaway is the importance of conducting a youth analysis up front as part of the design process. We recognize that some missions may be resource constrained. It won't always be possible to develop a dedicated youth analysis, but it's important to think of some creative ways that we can incorporate youth analysis tools into some of the other assessments that we're doing anyway. Gender assessments can certainly have a youth element to them. And I've also found that value chain analyses can be a really excellent vehicle for incorporating young people in thinking about the ways that young people can contribute within the context of Feed the Future programming. While analyses will differ in terms of the amount of depth that we go to, and that's partly dependent on whether we're designing a youth-specific program or whether we're designing a program that is more sort of youth-inclusive in nature and tries to bring young people into the kind of broader program interventions, there are three key things that every youth analysis should attempt to achieve. The first is segmentation and getting a clear sense of which youth segment or segments we are trying to target. The second is the identification of specific barriers to young people's inclusion in Feed the Future programming. And the third is the alignment of youth skills and interests with project objectives. And finally, and this is something that cuts across volumes 1 and 2, is the importance of kind of integrating and applying positive youth development to ensure that we're doing evidence-based work. And for those of you who are interested in positive youth development, Making Sense has developed a toolkit that deals entirely with PYD. For those of you who are familiar with PYD already, or for those of you who would like to inform yourselves a little bit more about that, even though that's something that's not dealt with explicitly in these 2 volumes of the guide, it does underpin a lot of what we've recommended in there, and I think you'll recognize a lot of that. So moving now over to volume 2, which focuses on implementation and is oriented a little bit more toward the contracting community. Some of the key takeaways there. The first is the importance of identifying appropriate value chain entry points for young people within the context of agricultural value chains. And when we do this, we really try to look at 2 key elements. One is the relevance of value chain activities, that is, to what extent are young people interested in engaging in these activities. And the second is its accessibility. To what extent can young people bring the skills and assets they have to bear on activities within each value chain. And in volume 2, we do look a little bit more closely at what those specific entry points are. We do also highlight some of the areas that we feel are particularly good entry points for women, but that's something you can find in the guide in a little more depth. The second is the importance of aligning workforce training needs with both current and future workforce training elements with both current and future youth needs. One of the interesting dynamics, I think, and one of the interesting challenges about what we do, and this was something that Patricia alluded to earlier, is the fact that while most of the opportunities that are being generated currently in agriculture are on-farm opportunities, many of the activities that interest young people are actually off-farm, and they may be upstream and downstream in the value chain. So how do we think about equipping young people with the kinds of skills that they're going to need in order to enter the value chain at entry points that exist today, while we also think about developing a set of transferable skills, a lot of which are soft skills, that will enable them to engage in value chain opportunities as they come online moving forward. And this may be in areas like input provision, processing, post-harvest activities like sorting and grading and packing. So, how do we think about simultaneously building those two sets of skills? The third key takeaway is the importance of wraparound services. In a lot of cases, when we do youth programming, we sort of treat, for example, youth training as a discrete activity with a beginning and an end. And what we view as the end of an activity may, in fact, for a lot of young people, be the beginning. And so what we really want to stress here is how do we provide that sort of continuous follow-up support that allows us to engage with young people, at least intermittently over the course of time. So, for example, in post-training, how do we think about providing mentorships and internships, job placement services that provide some sort of follow-up support for the needs of youth? The fourth is the importance of taking the supporting environment into account. It's, I think, fairly typical to think, when we think about youth programming, to think about engaging young people alone. But in reality, there's an entire support system, parents, community, institutions, and legal norms as well, that govern the ability of young people to engage in productive activities within agriculture. And so it's really important to engage that broader supporting community rather than just the youth themselves. In the same way that when we do gender programming, it's really important to engage men. It's I think equally important to think about how do we engage that wider support system when we're engaging youth. Something that I won't go into a lot of depth on now, but is we have an entire section devoted to it in the guide, is what are some of the special considerations that we need to take into account when we look at young people in the context of conflict-affected environments. And this is partly because the segmentation that we discussed earlier may not be directly relevant to young people, because a lot of young people have been sort of catapulted into a different phase of their lives prematurely, either as caregivers or as income earners. And the way that we think about youth segmentation in one environment may not necessarily be relevant to young people in a separate one. And then finally, as was the case with Volume 1, we do use positive youth development principles to sort of underpin a lot of the recommendations in there. Like I said, that's something that you hopefully will find useful as well. So hopefully that gives you at least kind of a basis for thinking about kind of what the guide contains, and we'll give you sort of a way of navigating the guide a little bit as you take a look through it. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Rachel, and she will explore some of the interaction dimensions of the guide.
Some of you might be very eager to take a look at the guide and get your hands on it. Right up here is the website where you can access both volumes 1 and 2 of the guide. For those of you who may not be accessing it right this minute, I'm going to actually walk through and show you what some of the key features of the guide are. It's a very user-friendly version. The online version is very user-friendly and allows a lot of navigation tools and icons. So we're looking at Volume 1 right now. This is the table of contents. And as you can see, we have each of the chapters have their own special tab. And Volume 1 is actually organized according to the project design process. As David mentioned, Volume 1 is focused on project design primarily for USAID staff or other donors that are designing projects pre-implementation stage. And so we have, and this volume is also aligned according to the USAID project design guidance. So we start first with the country development strategies, how to think about intentionally engaging youth in that process. And then we launch into project design phase, and then activity design, and then solicitation guidance for youth inclusive activities, and then some M&E guidance as well, in addition to various annexes and resources that are made available. Just to show you the interactive features, if we were to click on the project design process, and we will see here, actually let's go to solicitations here. You can see here I'm clicking here, and now we're suddenly in Chapter 5, and this is the tab for solicitations. but we can easily navigate back to the table of contents and look at other sections of the guide, and you can click back and forth here. And one interesting thing here is there's also some icons as well that highlight some cross-cutting features within the guide. So we give several examples from different country projects. We also highlight tips and pointers related to nutrition, resilience, and gender, and other features that are related to Feed the Future project design. And then right now I want to highlight to you a couple of things. I want to just show you a couple of sneak peeks at some of the things that you'll find in the guide. And one of them relates to the youth analysis, which David mentioned. So we thought about one of the things that we heard very loud and clear from USAID staff was that they wanted better guidance on how to do youth analysis for project design. And so actually, let's go there and then we'll go back to let's go to the project design, the next one, And so we developed actually a framework to help guide USAID staff in thinking about what are really the key considerations that a USAID staff member has to think about when designing a project. And it's a very flexible framework. And if we go to the next slide, essentially we have three major pools of considerations. So if you look on the left side in blue, actually on the left side of the arrow is the project design process. And so we start with, at the top of the page, there's project planning, and then the arrow goes down to the project design process, which is a period in which USAID staff are developing their project appraisal documents. And then at the very bottom is the activity design, which then leads to award. Throughout that entire process, USAID has to be asking a series of questions to help guide their various project design documents. And so we've tried to sort of phase the process accordingly in terms of the youth analysis. So at the very left side in blue is the first consideration, which is youth segmentation. As David mentioned, that not all youth are the same, and that if we want to intentionally engage youth in Feed the Future, we need to be thinking about what specific youth cohorts will we be targeting, and what are their key features, their aspirations, their assets, challenges within the agri-food system, and opportunities that we want to take advantage of. The second consideration in green is youth in the agri-food system. So how are youth engaging now in the agri-food system, and how do they relate to different actors and different influences within the system, and how does that system actually influence their own decisions and behaviors? And then finally, in the orange, we have cross-sectoral collaboration, where because of the nature of the agri-food system and Feed the Future, there's several opportunities for looking at how health, how civic participation or democracy and governance issues, how education impacts youth in the system, and vice versa. How can we take advantage of USAID and other donor investments in those other sectors to magnify Feed the Future outcomes? And so what we present in the guide is then essentially a series of questions that help guide USAID project designers along those different dimensions. And essentially, you'll see in the annex of the guide, there's actually a list of questions that reflect that framework. If we go on to the next slide, and we'll take a sneak peek at another tool that's in the guide, which is essentially sort of mapping out youth in the agri-food system. So what we're seeing here in this slide is, some of you might be very familiar with the Positive Youth Development Framework. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this, I would encourage you to go to some of the links that Lindsay has provided in your chat board there. It's basically thinking about what are the dimensions or the domains that help contribute to a healthy, productive, and engaged youth. And a Positive Youth Development Framework highlights 4 key domains. That first domain at the top is essentially building assets of a young person, or their skills and capabilities.
And then agency is basically a sense of developing a young person's ability to make decisions for themselves and exert influence over their lives. Third, we have the third domain is about increasing youth's contribution to their communities. And then finally, we have the enabling environment, which is essentially creating a supportive environment for positive youth development to take place. And so this is the framework that essentially, positive youth development framework that essentially shapes USAID's thinking about engagement of youth and youth development. So when we were developing the guide, we said, okay, this is really great. How does this apply to youth in the agri-food system? And so we started to look at another way of thinking about this framework, which is essentially, we sort of looked at, okay, well, what does the agri-food system look like? And some of you might recognize this framework, which is essentially developed from the Markets for the Poor approach, which is developed by the Springfield Center, which, if you look at the center of the donut, so to speak, in gray, would be an agriculture value chain. So we're looking at inputs to production, to post-harvest handling and storage, to processing, and then eventually going to markets. And so our first and foremost consideration when we think about integrating youth into the agri-food system is first about how do youth contribute to that system and how are they already engaged in that system? And we're calling that value chain entry points. And you'll see in volume 2 of the guide, there's a whole chapter on considerations for value chain entry points that are for youth. But beyond that, beyond the value chain, there's a number of supporting functions and rules and informal norms that shape how successful youth are in that value chain. And we looked at the evidence and we saw that there were some really salient dimensions of that. So if you look at the top under supporting functions, there's a various number of supporting functions such as access to information, infrastructure, technology, skills, related services that support how effective that value chain is, and within a youth context, how effective youth are within that agri-food system. When we looked at the evidence, we saw that the skills of young people, their assets and their agency, so again, going back to the positive youth development framework, that was a really strong shaping factor that defines or that helps influence how young people succeed in the agri-food system. If we go down to the bottom of the donut, or the green part, the rules, these are the formal rules and informal norms and rules that, again, govern youth's interactions in the agri-food system. And we see at the left, at the bottom there, again, a lot of the evidence points to the importance of finance policy and practices, as well as land policy and practices. And Ignatius and Patricia mentioned the importance of policy in determining youth success in the agri-food system. And in fact, we do see the evidence supporting that, specifically in those two areas. And then finally, on the right, the bottom right, is the importance of families and communities and peers and how they shape youth behaviors and decisions and success factors within the agri-food system. And here again, relating this to the positive youth development framework, this relates to youth agency and the enabling environment. And again, there's an emerging body of research that is really showing how important families and communities and peers are in shaping young people's behaviors in the agri-food system. And so, so we wanted to highlight as that. So hopefully this helps provide some kind of framework for thinking about youth engagement in the agri-food system. And obviously this is not static and is meant to sort of be a framework that maybe can help folks think about when they want to intentionally engage youth in the agri-food system, how these variety of factors might be influencing the success or the impact of the project. If we could just go back to the evidence slide. As I mentioned, we did look at the evidence when we were developing this guide, and we conducted a desk review, which is available on the Youth Power website. It's right there up on youthpower.org, and it's What Works in Youth and Agriculture, Food Security, and Nutrition. And we found essentially, first of all, we found that there's a number of reports and studies out there, and we first found that there was a large body of research that examined the political and economic imperative of engaging youth in agriculture. And Ignatius mentioned this as well, about the high rates of youth unemployment, the high potential of the agriculture sector in providing opportunities for youth employment, especially in the near term, and the importance of the informal sector. And the second group of studies we found were those that related to youth's roles and aspirations in the agriculture sector. And we found a lot of evidence that highlighted how youth earn mixed livelihoods from various sources, so both on-farm, off-farm, and non-farm, and the important role that self-employment plays in this mix. We also know that youth are migrating to urban areas, but they also often migrate back to rural areas, and it's often very seasonal, or it may depend on their personal circumstances. There's some evidence that youth are turning away from agriculture. Many of you might have had your own experiences with youth not necessarily being attracted to agriculture, and Patricia mentioned this about how there's ways to attract young people either through the use of ICT or high value added crops. And David also referred to this as well. Generally speaking, we know that youth tend to favor modern agriculture practices, the use of technology, and opportunities for quick money with relatively higher returns than staple crops. But as I mentioned before, youth's decisions to engage in agriculture are also shaped largely by the environment in which they live. So that could include the economic and political context, social norms and customs. It could depend on the nature of the agri-food system or the institutions or the laws and regulations, as much as it is parental and peer influence or media or even gender relations. And often programs underemphasize the importance of this environment, and which is why I had highlighted that systems graphic earlier, to really essentially highlight how important those social and cultural norms and other rules influence youth decision making. Then we also found that research looked at the constraints to youth participation, and as I mentioned before, three major factors are really pointed in the evidence. One is access to land, two is access to finance, and three, again, is the skills, and making sure that the skills of the youth cohorts that you're targeting are aligned with the objectives of the project and the demands of the agri-food system. And so again, those are three really important considerations for project design, is how do those aspects either enable or challenge the success of the project in terms of engaging youth in those activities. Finally, we found that while there's a growing body of work on women's empowerment in agri-food system, interestingly, the literature doesn't distinguish between different age cohorts or life stages of those women. So we don't really see much nuances in terms of when we talk about women, looking at what their stage of development is. Are they a head of household? What is their child or parental status or their marital status or other factors? Also, we found that women's empowerment approaches tend to overlook the needs of or the pressures faced by adolescent males who are coming of age in the agriculture sector. And this is really important for adolescents because they are at a time where they're shaping their sense of themselves and norms and how they interact in society just as much as young females. And so it's important that we pay attention to that as well. I should finally, when we look at the evidence, I'll conclude by just saying that in spite of all of this evidence that we're finding in terms of the characteristics of youth engagement in the agri-food system and some of the bigger political or economic imperatives, there are very few evaluations that examine the impact of youth economic opportunity interventions in rural areas. We were unable to find a single evaluation of youth inclusive interventions in the agro-food sector specifically. If any of you that are on this webinar are aware of an impact evaluation of youth activities in the agri-food sector, please let us know. We welcome to add that to our website. And then moreover, we're not really quite certain at this point how much or in what ways intentional youth inclusion makes a difference for achieving Feed the Future outcomes. And so while I can't speak for USAID, I, at least as part of the Making Sense team, looking at this evidence, we definitely encourage USAID missions and implementing partners to help contribute to this evidence base. to look at what types of youth inclusive interventions in the agri-food sector contribute to the different Feed the Future outcomes, whether it's increased agriculture productivity, whether it's increasing incomes, job creation, or resilience. We definitely need more evidence in this area of what interventions relate to what kinds of outcomes. Finally, again, for those of you who want a summary of this evidence, it's available on the Youth Power website, where you will find the guide as well. And so I'll just turn it quickly then to close. I'll turn it over to Meredith for closing.
Great. Well, now that you all have had an overview of the project design guide, we hope that you'll go download volumes 1 and 2 on the Youth Power website. And in a few days, we hope to also have it available on the Feed the Future website, which you can see both of those on your screens right now. Additionally, we have 2 upcoming trainings for USAID staff. The first will be in DC tomorrow, May 10th, and the second in Bangkok on May 14th. And we're hoping to schedule a few more of those trainings in upcoming months. You'll find those and the new trainings on the USAID University website. And if you can't attend the trainings, don't worry, this guide was designed to be user-friendly. So we hope that no matter what stage you are in the program cycle, you can pick this up and find some tools and resources to help you think about engaging youth. And lastly, just a reminder that USAID Washington is and will continue to be a resource for you as you design and implement your programs. Great.
Perfect. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and turn it on over to some of the questions that have come through the chat box. We've been pulling these on out and looking at them, and as we have the team here in this room, we'll openly discuss some of the questions that have come through. One of the questions that came through is understanding the skills that young people are really being asked of, and what is needed for a young person to succeed. I'll get started in answering that, but then want to bring some other people on in. This is one of the things that we addressed in Volume 2, and where we put forward a skills pyramid where we looked at what are some of the foundational skills that are necessary for a young person to succeed in agriculture and in life in general. And so in this space, we really focused in on the transferable skills, understanding that young people are at a dynamic place in their life as their own life moves about, and also that their interaction with agriculture changes over time. And so we focused in on some of the basics of really highlighting out the impact that literacy and numeracy has, and then next focusing in on the cross-cutting soft skills or non-cognitive skills. Oftentimes when we look at engaging youth in agriculture, we start with those cognitive, harder, technical agric skills. And one of the things that we found, and that the evidence from positive youth development and the youth power work has really shown, as the influence of those softer skills on the non-cognitive space. And so we really pulled that on out. With that response, I do want to open it up to the room. Maybe starting here kind of with the two of you. Ignatius, I know that you spend a lot of time building the skills of youth in agriculture. And so I definitely welcome you to share what are some of those key skills that you are focusing on in your work when you're engaging with young people.
At the academy, we are trying to evoke the spirit of innovation amongst the youth and the young farmers. So we believe that if they really understood what innovation in the agriculture workspace looks like, they will be able to overcome any challenge that comes their way. That's one of the things we do in our programs. Then we also look at the basics, because if you're dealing with a 15-year-old, you're trying to show them how things are supposed to be done in this generation in terms of agriculture, then you have to start with the basics, because you realize they've grown up from peasant farming families based in the rural area. So the skills that they have are kind of traditional, because this is something their parents are doing. Their parents are doing it because their ancestors did it. So there's need to change the way they are doing agriculture, because as you know, the climate is changing. Therefore, the skills are supposed to change. So we start with the basics of how to do this, how to do that. How do you establish an agricultural enterprise? How do you establish, for instance, an indigenous chicken production unit? How do you commercialize that? So we begin with the basics. How do you plan an agricultural enterprise? Then how do you implement it? We go through experiential learning. Basically, that's how we do it at the academy.
Yeah, no, that's great. Of really that mix of the cognitive, non-cognitive, but based in the experiential learning, and that's been the core of your success in HIS is you've got to interact, put your hands in the soil, and figure it out. This is not classroom-based lecture-style learning in order to succeed. Perfect.
I think one of the really interesting dimensions too when we think about skill building is, especially when we're engaging younger youth, 15 to 18 years old, we can't assume that they're necessarily going to end up in agriculture. There's been a notion that's been called instrumental agriculture, that there are some young people who are simply sort of passing through the field of agriculture en route to either earning enough money to obtain an education or to start a business that may be inside or outside of agriculture. And so, one of the things we ought to be thinking about is how do we accommodate that group and recognize that agriculture can be a really important mechanism for building life skills, especially some of these soft and transferable skills, without sort of mandating or necessarily assuming a career path in the field of agriculture. Because, we don't know, most of us at 15 or 18 years old didn't know for sure where we were going to end up. So I think that's something that's important to take into consideration as well.
Great. Another question that we came in was really asking around youth participation in agriculture versus the adult population, and knowing that the average age of farmers is significantly high. In the United States alone, the average age of a farmer is 57 years old, and that's actually considered on some of the younger side of a lot of different countries around the world. So this is a global phenomenon. One of the things that we do know, though, is that young people are involved in agriculture, though they are not always in the decision-making role or the landowner of in the agriculture side. But just because it doesn't have their name on the title of the land doesn't mean that they are involved with it. And this is something that Patricia has spent a lot of time, working with and engaging with. So, Patricia, maybe you can share some of your experiences of how young people are actually involved in agriculture.
I think the way young people are getting involved in agriculture, and especially in East Africa where we do most of our work, is getting the access to the land, and not so much owning the land itself, but that now looking at the option of leasing the land from their parents in order to, do something with it and make money out of it. Another way is we've been encouraging the older generation to diversify their farms' incomes by also agreeing to lease the land to their children. So that way we are not stepping on any of the traditional taboos, because land inheritance in Africa is a big issue. And it's a tricky thing because it's a cultural issue. So through leasing and renting the land, the youth are able to then engage in agriculture. And we're also seeing a move from just, the youth engaging in the actual farming, but then now going on to post-harvest. So they're becoming more of the middlemen, where they're buying the produce, adding value to it. If it's, tomatoes, you're buying the tomatoes and making tomato paste or ketchup. And that is one of the ways that we're seeing in East Africa that the youth are engaging in farming.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point, is when we look at measuring age in agriculture, we often look at the production side, where we know a lot of the opportunities for young people that are still around production as the markets and economies develop are going to move into the off-farm activities, which is still engaged in agriculture very heavily with that. Another question that came through was around the wraparound services that young people need. One of the beneficial things that we've found about the wraparound services is that it allows us to really extend the support that a young person needs in this time of transition in order to ensure their success in agriculture and be able to provide them with that diverse amount of skill set that they need. This is also an opportunity for Feed the Future to be able to get into some of the other cross-cutting items of resiliency and health and nutrition.
as a lot of the wraparound services do also address family planning, support, counseling that is not just around mentorship of starting a business, but is around life counseling, trauma, stress, conflict-affected areas, and which is one of the reasons of why we see such a large amount of success with young people when they reach this, is understanding they're dynamic humans, and that we might be engaging them around one specific thing of the agriculture space. They have a lot more that's happening in their life at this point, and so need a lot of those additional services.
Yeah, and I would just, again, highlight one of the key, if there's one thing that I hope folks can take away from this guide is the importance of the youth segmentation and recognizing the particular characteristics of different youth cohorts. And related to the ongoing support or the wraparound services, those are really determined by that youth cohort. So what kinds of assets does that youth segment possess? What are they living in a conflict-affected context? Maybe they need psychosocial support services. Maybe where are they in terms of their employment status? If they're maybe an older adolescent that's entering the job market for the first time, they might require job intermediation services. Or if they're entering self-employment or the informal sector, they might want market facilitation or enterprise development support. If they're a young mother or a person that's becoming sexually active, they might want sexual and reproductive health services. So it really, again, it goes back to understanding who your youth cohort is and what are the various factors that are influencing their ability to successfully engage in the agri-food sector and what kinds of support services can enable that success.
Great. Another question that we received was around the gender integration into the guide. As Rachel pointed out when she showed some of the features of the guide and the different icons that were used, gender was highly considered when thinking about this, and we've made some very specific places to note some stronger gender considerations. One of the components that we do want to highlight is going back to what David said of really bringing out in Volume 1 and understanding the youth cohort and the impact that this has. Oftentimes when we look at designing youth-inclusive agriculture, we end up selecting certain youth who are able to succeed in these environments. And as David noted, oftentimes this is older male youth who have greater access to assets. And so when we want to take a stronger lens towards more vulnerable populations, and particularly of inclusion in young women, we really need to think through what is that cohort and how do we intentionally target them, and what does that mean for our expectations of how they engage. How a 17-year-old young woman engages in agriculture is going to be completely different than how a 28-year-old male engages in agriculture. And that's something that we need to recognize in order to really make sure that we're inclusive of all youth in agriculture. Let's see here. I think another question that we had, and maybe our last one for right now, is just kind of highlighting different ways of engaging youth in agriculture. This is something that Ignatius and Patricia talked a bit about, and that we also highlighted a lot in Volume 1, is really wanting to ensure that young people are engaged throughout the process. And I think that that's something that our two youth voices really strongly said. Young people have a voice and they want it to be heard, and that means for us of the donor and implementation community that we need to respond to that and find a place for their meaningful engagement and participation. Is there anything else that the two of you would like to say about engaging young people, or where their voices should be heard, or how they should be said?
I think we should come up with platforms or spaces where we give these young men and women chance to speak out what they feel works best for them in their communities, because they exist in the communities, but then the medium of communication between them and the policymakers is really lagging. There is space between them and the policymakers, as the policymakers in our countries only come to you if they need your vote. but then after that you will not see them again. So there is need to develop platforms and spaces that enable these young men and women to transfer their voice and speak about what they think would be good for them. Because there is not a lot of ICTs in rural areas of Uganda. So we need really spaces that these young men can easily access. The rate at which these people in rural areas are adapting to smartphones, for instance, is so low, they can't afford them. But then we need better spaces through which these young men and women can communicate their voices to the policymakers.
Yeah, I think I echo the same sentiments that Ignatius has talked about. We need to continuously arm young farmers and entrepreneurs with the basic knowledge in farm business startups. This includes business planning, access to finance, access to inputs, managing the production, and access to markets profitability. We really need to continue investing heavily in this sector in order to ensure that the young farmers will make a business out of this that's actually viable. Yes.
Yeah, and gives them a voice in it, for sure. It's hard to have a voice when you have no access to any sort of resources or to be able to have a say. One of the questions that just came through was on really specific market opportunities and how to ensure that we link young people to those. And in the guide, we talk about the entry points into the value chain and making sure that they are viable entry points for young people to then be able to move in agriculture from there. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rachel to speak a little bit more on that.
Yeah, so we do focus on essentially the entry points chapter of Volume 2 discusses how to align youth aspirations and circumstances with the demands of the market. So we assume that there has been some kind of demand assessment. We do not go into how to identify demand in this particular guide. USAID has done a very good job of developing a nice set of tools for doing value chain assessments and identifying market demand across the value chain. For any of those out there who may be wanting to look at that, you could go to, is it Market Links? AgriLinks, thank you, agrilinks.org. And there's a lot of tools there for identifying market demand. So we assume that people are using those tools, and our guide is really to help then, once you've done that demand assessment, to then align that demand with the particular circumstances and assets and agency of the youth cohorts that you're targeting.
Yeah, and one thing I would add to that is another potential mechanism for identifying some of those opportunities is actually, in the course of a value chain analysis, the identification of some of the constraints in the value chain. A lot of times when we do a constraints analysis, it highlights either where there are either weak functions or functions that are absent. And in a lot of cases, we found those actually equate to entrepreneurial opportunity for young people. And so trying to align the value chain constraints analysis with youth opportunities, especially for entrepreneurship, I think can be a pretty powerful way of ensuring kind of a win-win to make sure that youth integration and inclusion is actually contributing to value chain upgrading, which I would argue at least also leads to more sustainable opportunities for young people.
Great. As that kind of wraps up our question and answer, one of the things that I want to do is to leave our space with youth voices and giving our two young people a chance to be able to say some of the last words and maybe talk a bit about the work that they're doing and how you can not just only follow what USAID is doing in the industry, but also these dynamic two young people who are in the room. So let's maybe start with Patricia. Kind of, some last voices in there.
I would say the use of mass media, which is locally available to most, African and young people in Africa, is one way that people can communicate and reach large masses of people with a message that they have, whether it's giving people knowledge in farming, whether it's changing the social barriers of what it means to start a business, whether we're trying to stem the exodus of rural youth to urban areas. I think mass media is one way to go about it, and this is the use of TV, radio, SMS. That is one of the most powerful tools that we can use to reach this youth.
And with that, I would say, everybody who's listening, you do need to go check out Patricia's TV show, Don't Lose the Plot. It is available for you to see online, and it is a fabulous show that highlights several young people in Tanzania and Kenya and runs through a reality TV show of them running a farm for a year in a competition. So it's definitely worthwhile everyone's time, and they should go check it out. Again, it's called Don't Lose the Plot.
Oh, I'll start with exactly what the Art Planet Academy does. At the Art Planet Academy, we are creating a center of agro-innovations, agricultural innovations. Now, this is a place where we create agricultural innovations that promote productivity, innovations that create market for the farmers. So basically what we do, we replicate innovation that has worked elsewhere and test it in the local context. When these innovations work out, we create the practical agriculture training curriculum. Now, we use this curriculum to train youth between the ages of 15 and 35 into specific agribusiness developers. You are recruited to acquire skills in a specific agricultural enterprise. It could be indigenous chicken production, it could be horticulture. Now, during your study period, you undergo 3 phases of our curriculum, in which the first phase is experiential learning. In experiential learning, you take up the marketing, development, and administration of that specific enterprise. When you finish that first phase, you go to the second phase, which is a training phase. So in the training phase, you do trainings to children in primary and secondary schools. You replicate a training in that specific enterprise. Because it's a practical training, agricultural enterprises are established in schools. You then work with individual children in that school to extend that training into their homes. As a result, agricultural enterprises are established in homes. So you will be able to see that agricultural enterprises in homes have elevated families' incomes by about $8 a week, and the enterprises in schools help rural schools save about $100 per year. So when you finish these 2 phases, then you go to the third phase, which is a replication phase, in which you replicate that enterprise into your home. So you're able to create a source of employment for your own self and an enterprise that will employ very many other people. We are sure by the time you finish those 3 phases, you have acquired the 3 basic skills of training, agriculture, agribusiness development, and management. So we think that with that approach, we are trying to build the next generation of young agriculture entrepreneurs in Africa. Our only our call out is there is need for support to develop the next generation of young African entrepreneurs, especially agricultural entrepreneurs, because we believe the future of our continent is typically an agricultural revolution that will transform us. So you never know who could be listening in, but it's quite a huge problem. We need to develop entrepreneurs, because entrepreneurs will create jobs. These jobs will then transform, they will power the transformation of Africa.
And we've included a link over to Ignatius' work on this, and do contact him because he's open to franchising options and being able to expand out into other parts of Uganda and probably globally. So do reach out to him on that. Perfect. Well, we want to thank everybody for joining us today, and want to leave you with just a few last links to how you can stay involved. So please do stay linked in with youthpower.org. This is where you can find the resources that we discussed today, the newly released guide that was just uploaded last night, and also find the evidence and the research behind things on the What Works pages that are also on Youth Power. This will also be linked in on the Feed the Future website in the near future, so be looking for it there as well. So with that, thank you everyone, and please enjoy the rest of your day.